trying to figure out what the future holds. It can feel a bit like staring into a dense fog, can't it?
It really can. No crystal balls,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, definitely not. But, smart people in governments, think tanks, businesses, they're always trying to analyze these complex forces shaping our world.
Constantly analyzing, projecting trends.
So what if we could look back at one of those analyses, not just to grade them, like were they right or wrong,
Right, not just a scorecard.
but to understand how they thought about the future, from their specific place and time?
That's a really interesting way to approach it.
Well, today we're doing exactly that, taking a deep dive into that kind of analysis, but with a fascinating twist.
Okay.
We're looking at a document called Strategic Trends. It was produced way back in 2007.
2007, okay. So almost 2 decades ago now.
Yeah, by the UK Ministry of Defence's analytical arm, the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, or DCDC.
The DCDC.
Right.
Right. And this wasn't just like a casual look ahead, was it? It had a real purpose.
No, not at all. Its specific mission, they said, was to provide an independent, detailed assessment of the global context, looking out 30 years.
30 years. So from 2007 all the way to 2036.
Exactly. And they did this specifically to inform UK defense policy, trying to spot the big challenges, opportunities, risks, even potential shocks the future might hold.
Shocks. Okay. The big surprises.
What makes this document particularly interesting for you, our listener, is how it presented itself. It was framed as an independent view, explicitly not official government policy.
That's important. Gives them a bit more freedom, maybe.
I think so. And it drew on a really broad range of sources, not just military stuff, academia, NGOs.
Business? So casting a wide net.
Yeah, and they deliberately sought out diverse perspectives, from outside the Western world, too.
That's crucial for a global picture.
They knew they wouldn't be perfectly right. I mean, the future's unpredictable, isn't it?
Of course. Always is.
The goal, and I'm quoting here, was to rehearse possibilities so one is better able to respond if they happen.
Rehearse possibilities. I like that. It's about preparation, not prediction. A kind of disciplined imagination.
Exactly. Understanding the potential pathways, knowing that surprises are, well, inevitable. So our deep dive today is to unpack this comprehensive assessment from almost 2 decades ago.
Right.
We'll explore what this 2007 view thought the world might look like by 2036. Dig into the key insights, some specific details they highlighted, the major risks, those wild cards.
It's like getting a snapshot of the future, but taken from the past.
Yeah, exactly. A past perspective on what might be coming. Okay, let's unpack this.
All right.
So to really get a handle on what they found, maybe we should start with how the DCDC team went about this. I mean, forecasting global trends over 30 years? That's a huge task.
It really is. They used a pretty systematic method, actually. They looked across 5 major dimensions of global change, sort of the key areas where big shifts happen.
5 dimensions. What were they?
Let's see. Resource, social, political, science and technology, and military.
Okay, so covering the main bases, really. Mapping the landscape of change across those areas.
Precisely. Within each one, they identified the major trends already happening back in 2007. Then, well, they projected those trends forward.
Right.
Analyzing how they were likely to develop, how they might interact over the next 30 years.
Interactions are key, aren't they? Things don't happen in isolation.
Absolutely not. They aimed to establish a range of probable outcomes, but they were careful. They said, nothing in the future is guaranteed. So they also looked at alternative outcomes.
Alternative, so less likely scenarios.
Yeah, less probable, but still plausible things that could happen instead. They weren't just picking one future,
No, it sounds like they were mapping a whole set of potential futures.
Exactly. And from those potential futures, they identified specific risks.
Risks, like the downsides.
The adverse consequences, yeah, that could come about as these trends played out. And then maybe, most interestingly, they considered strategic shocks.
Ah, yes, the shocks. You mentioned those. Major discontinuities. Unexpected events.
Totally unexpected things that could just change the whole picture, even if they seemed really unlikely or hadn't happened for ages.
Like a huge natural disaster, maybe, or some kind of, revolutionary tech breakthrough.
Yeah, exactly. They even gave historical examples like the destruction of the Minoan civilization, maybe by a volcano, or the impact of the Black Death.
Wow, okay. So, really big landscape-altering stuff.
It's a reminder that the totally unexpected can happen. And it can reshape everything.
That really underlines the need for preparedness, doesn't it? Not just prediction.
Mm-hmm.
Being ready for possibilities.
How did they signal, their confidence levels? Did they just say, this is probable.
No, they were actually very specific about it. They used probability terms based on the evidence they had.
Okay.
Will meant like over 95% probability. Likely or probably was over 60%. May or possibly was over 10%. And unlikely or improbable was less than 10%.
Okay. So they put rough odds on things.
Yeah, basically saying, based on what we see now, here's how likely we think this is. That's a useful framework.
Mm.
And you mentioned they used a wide range of sources, deliberately looking for non-Western views. How do they manage that?
Well, they really stressed needing a broad and diverse evidence base just for rigor.
Makes sense.
They consulted widely government, academia, NGOs, business internationally, as well as in the UK. And a key thing was trying to avoid a purely Western lens.
Right.
So they commissioned a survey through an organization called LED International.
LED International.
Yeah, they have this global network of opinion formers. And the survey specifically focused on getting perspectives predominantly from outside the Western world.
That sounds genuinely robust, especially for 2007, trying to get that global perspective.
Yeah, I think they made a real effort.
So with that method, that broad perspective, what was their overarching view? What was the big picture they saw taking shape by 2036?
Well, the document's key finding, the sort of headline, was that the defining feature of the next 30 years would be this constant dynamic tension.
Tension between?
Between greater interdependence and intensifying competition.
Interdependence and competition.
Wow.
That sounds like a fundamental conflict right there.
It really does. And they saw that tension playing out everywhere.
How so?
They saw it as the driving force behind how people, communities, countries would choose to respond to change.
Okay.
Would they try to, promote change, exploit it through cooperation, or would they resist it, try to reverse it, leading to obstruction, competition, maybe even predatory behavior?
So exploit change or resist it, that push and pull.
Exactly. They expected it to manifest in every area of life, changing things at what they called an unprecedented rate.
Unprecedented rate. So faster change than ever before.
That was the expectation.
So this core tension was the engine. And within that, they identified three really big forces. They called them ring road issues.
Yeah, the ring road issues. The idea was these were the foundational things that would touch everyone, everywhere on the planet.
Okay, what were they?
Three big ones: climate change, globalization, and global inequality. Foundational shifts, not just trends.
Right, let's take those one by one. Climate change first. What were they saying about that back in 2007, looking ahead?
Well, they stated pretty clearly there was compelling evidence to indicate that climate change is occurring.
Okay, no hedging there.
No. And that the atmosphere would continue to warm at an unprecedented rate through the 21st century. They linked a significant part of it directly to human activities.
Right.
And they saw it intensifying, partly because of things like melting ice and the loss of natural carbon sinks, forests and oceans absorbing less CO2.
And the consequences they predicted. What did they see coming?
A whole range of things. Variable, uneven impacts, both gradual changes and potentially sudden instabilities.
Such as?
Well, melting ice caps, obviously. Sea level rise. Changes to major ocean currents, which affects weather patterns massively.
Yeah.
Desertification in some regions, permanent flooding in others. They highlighted this chilling risk of vast, abrupt methane releases.
From where?
From melting permafrost, especially in the Arctic, and from deep ocean hydrates. A sudden release could trigger runaway warming.
Runaway warming.
Wow. Yeah. They also projected major shifts in agriculture, tropical diseases spreading north, more extreme weather events, floods, droughts, storms. They were clear it was complex and would remain highly politicized.
It's striking how much of the climate impact discussion now was clearly on their radar almost 20 years ago.
It really is that the science was pointing that way.
Okay, what about the second ring road issue? Globalization.
They saw the world economy growing more quickly than at any time in human history. That's a big statement.
Huge.
And becoming far more tightly integrated, socioeconomically, creating global interdependencies, linkages, connecting everything: trade, finance, communications, culture.
The world getting smaller, essentially.
In many ways, yes. More connected.
And the third one, global inequality. How did that fit in with this picture of growth and connection?
That's where the tension really bites. They expected that while material conditions were likely to improve for most people globally over the 30 years.
So, some progress for many.
Yes, but the gap between rich and poor would probably increase. Absolute poverty, they said, would remain a significant global challenge.
So, a rising tide lifts many boats, but the yachts pull much further ahead. Is that the idea?
That's a very good way to put it. And the document really highlighted how globalization and, crucially, the rapid increase in access to telecommunications, mobile phones, internet,
Right.
would make these disparities far more visible than ever before, both within countries and between them.
Ah, visibility, so people can see the gap more clearly.
Exactly. And this heightened awareness, they believed, would fuel grievance, resentment, increasing tension and instability.
Making inequality visible breeds discontent. It makes intuitive sense. How did they see that actually playing out? What forms would that instability take?
They expected it could lead to increased disorder, more criminality, terrorism, insurgency, and they even anticipated it might trigger a resurgence of certain ideologies.
Ideologies, like what?
Anti-capitalist ideas, maybe linked to religious or anarchist movements, populism. Even, they suggested, a revival of Marxism.
Wow. That connection between seeing inequality and a potential revival of old political ideologies, that's a really striking prediction from 2007.
It shows how they saw these economic and tech trends having really profound social and political consequences. It's not just about money, it's about perception and reaction.
Absolutely. So these three huge forces, climate change, globalization, global inequality, they set the stage, the fundamental context.
Right, the ring roads.
And within that context, they grouped the many drivers of change into 4 key themes, you said.
Yeah, they distilled all the specific drivers they identified across the 5 dimensions into 4 broad themes. These themes would shape the strategies and approaches people and states took globally.
What were the 4 themes?
Population and resources, identity and interests, governance and order, and knowledge and innovation.
Okay, let's dig into the first one. Population and resources. What was the core challenge they saw there?
The core idea was pretty stark, really. Sustained population growth combined with aggressive economic competition from globalization, plus increased consumption, modernization, urbanization. Altogether, it would put intense pressure on resources.
All kinds of resources.
Everything. Energy, food, water, even land.
Which specific resources were they most worried about, like the flow of them?
Energy, food, and water were flagged as absolutely critical, with constant potential for fluctuations, imbalances.
And where would these pressures hit hardest?
They expected them to be most intense in low and lower middle income regions, especially where population growth was high compared to local resources. And climate change, they noted, would significantly aggravate all of this.
It sounds like they were forecasting resource scarcity becoming a major source of conflict then.
They definitely saw a clear link, that expansion of global media and ICT we talked about.
Making things visible again?
Yeah. It would heighten the sense of grievance and marginalization between the haves and have-nots when it came to accessing resources. This could lead to humanitarian crises, local conflicts.
But potentially bigger conflicts, too.
Yes. When these resource challenges were tied to strategic resources, oil, gas, water in some regions, they concluded it may increase the incidence and risk of international confrontation.
International conflict over resources.
Yeah.
That's a heavy forecast. What about health? Did that feature in this theme?
It did. They expected communicable diseases to remain a big issue, new ones emerging, the constant risk of pandemics.
Right.
They specifically mentioned the reemergence of diseases like TB, malaria, cholera, partly due to environmental changes, people moving around more, and HIV/AIDS was expected to remain prevalent.
Affecting development.
Hugely. Its impact would be long-lasting, likely slowing economic growth drastically in affected regions for at least the first half of the period. That was even though they thought a cure or vaccine was likely before 2035.
Okay, let's look at some of the specific drivers they highlighted under population and resources. First up, economic growth.
They projected global economic growth was likely to keep going at a pretty robust pace, maybe 2–3% annually, at least up to 2020.
But unevenly.
Very unevenly. Asia-Pacific was expected to see dramatic growth, but regions like sub-Saharan Africa were likely to lag behind. They cited environmental issues, political instability, demographics, corruption as drags on growth there.
And population growth itself, the sheer numbers.
The global population was likely to grow significantly, from about 6.5 billion in 2006 to 8.5 billion by 2035.
2 billion more people.
Yeah. And the greatest growth was expected in those regions already facing material and economic risks. Sub-Saharan Africa, again, they projected its population likely to grow by a massive 81%.
1%.
To over 1.3 billion people by 2035. And they noted 15% of that population was likely to be undernourished. Even with more birth control available, cultural factors in some places were expected to keep reproduction rates high.
So, huge population increase concentrated in vulnerable regions. That feeds directly into resource competition, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Economic growth plus more people equals increased consumption, driving up demand intensely. Demand for energy alone was likely to grow by more than half again by 2035.
More than half again.
Wow. And fossil fuels would need to meet over 80% of that increase they projected. Since major reserves are often in politically unstable regions, big consumer nations were likely to be increasingly reluctant to just trust the market for security of supply.
That logic seems pretty straightforward, unfortunately. What about demographics beyond just the total numbers? Age structure, things like that.
They saw big shifts there, too. The balance between economically active people and those dependent kids, the elderly, would change significantly.
How so?
Sharp age differences between the aging populations of the developed world, the first world, and the very youthful populations of the developing world, the third world. Overall, the global population was aging, though. Cyclical unemployment was expected to become more widespread, especially among the growing urban poor. They thought the urban poor were likely to make up maybe 25% of the global population.
A quarter of the world's population.
Yeah. And marked age and gender imbalances in some regions would just accentuate existing social and political tensions. Increased immigration to the developed world would partly offset their aging populations, but would bring its own pressures, containment issues.
So the pressures aren't just about total numbers, but about who is where, their age, whether they have work. It paints a picture of a world under considerable strain. Basic human needs clashing with global economics and the environment.
That's a good summary of the pressures they saw building.
Let's move to key theme 2, identity and interest. How did they see identity evolving in this increasingly connected, globalized, mobile world?
The core idea here was that globalized communications, internet, mobile phones, again, would give groups and individuals just unprecedented visibility. You could see how others lived, their advantages, their disadvantages.
And easier ways to act on that.
Exactly. Easier means to exploit opportunities. Physical security would still be crucial, of course, but identity itself would become more layered.
Layered, what do you mean?
Individual identities were expected to become more complex, people moving between cultures, contexts. You draw on your origins, sure, but also acquire features from your adoptive surroundings. It mixes things up.
Okay.
And collective identities groups people belong to would increasingly form around common interests and could dissolve pretty rapidly when those interests changed. Though deep ties like nationhood, ethnicity, they'd still be powerful emotional forces.
So identity becomes maybe more fluid, more chosen based on interests shaped by global connections. But those older, deeper ties, national or ethnic, remain really potent.
That's the picture. And increased mobility, people moving around, played a big role. Yeah. More fluid movement across borders was expected to lead to the growth of large diaspora and expatriate communities.
Yeah.
And these weren't just temporary clusters. They'd create distinct enclaves with extensive, persistent links back to their countries of origin, all enabled by technology keeping them connected.
What were the key drivers they identified for these shifts in identity and interest? What was pushing this?
A major one was simply access to information. Pervasive ICT enabling far more people to access and exploit these interconnected global systems.
Right.
They made a specific forecast here that's interesting to look back on. It was estimated that 20% of the African population would subscribe to internet-enabled mobile phones by 2010.
Wow. 20% by 2010. That's quite precise for a 2007 document looking ahead. Did that happen?
I'd have to check the exact numbers, but mobile adoption in Africa certainly exploded around that time. The point was, the internet and digital comms were expected to become the primary way information and entertainment got distributed globally.
What else was driving this?
Communitarianism. That's maybe a less familiar term.
Yeah, what does that mean?
It refers to a trend where, as populations grow, especially concentrating in huge cities, and work becomes more informal, governments struggle. They can't always keep up with providing infrastructure, services, security.
Okay.
So people tend to rely less on the formal state, civic support might decline, and instead people increase their reliance on local communities, extended family networks, personal connections, patronage.
So relying on your local network when the state struggles? And cultural complexity. That was another driver.
Yeah. Simply put, increasing numbers of people would just become accustomed to dealing with cultural complexity and mobility. Living in or visiting cosmopolitan centers created by migration makes it normal.
Right.
English was likely to consolidate its position as the dominant international language for business, science, culture. But supplementary languages like Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic may also proliferate as global communication increases.
More languages in play globally.
Yeah. And they even anticipated that sophisticated translation devices were likely to become widely available before 2035, making cultural mixing even easier.
Technology, again, smoothing the path. So tech enables communication, mobility, leads to more mixed societies. But you mentioned traditional values still matter, which brings us to the last driver for this theme, changing values.
Yes. Secularism and materialism were likely to grow globally following trends already seen in more developed regions.
Okay.
And cultural mixing, the sheer pace of change, modern and traditional values bumping up against each other, this would increase the trend towards what they called moral relativism, pragmatic value.
Moral relativism, meaning what exactly?
Essentially, with exposure to so many different ideas and rapid shifts, maybe traditional rigid belief systems loosen their grip. Values become more adaptable, maybe more self-interested, or depend more on the specific situation.
But that would cause a reaction.
Exactly. This trend towards relativism would trigger strong responses from traditional communities, minorities, people seeking refuge in more rigid belief systems, including religious orthodoxy, or doctrine political ideologies, populism, even Marxism, they mentioned again.
That connection between changing values and a retreat to rigid beliefs. That ties right back to the global inequality point, doesn't it? The resentment fueled by visibility.
It does. It really seems like technology and connectivity cut both ways in their analysis, enabling progress and collaboration, sure, but also fueling tension, division, reaction.
A double-edged sword. Okay, let's move to key theme 3, governance and order. What was the core challenge they saw here? How would states cope?
The core challenge was that states and communities would be progressively challenged by the sheer range and complexity of risks, both national and transnational, and they anticipated that some simply wouldn't cope. They'd be overwhelmed.
And because of globalization, interconnectedness, those local failures wouldn't stay local. They'd have ripple effects.
Absolutely. Stability challenges state failure. Major crises were expected to have interconnected consequences. Local, regional, even global, thanks to communications and global engagement.
So what was the solution? More cooperation.
They saw a growing understanding that purely local solutions often weren't enough. So governments would increasingly seek international cooperative solutions, forming new institutions, new mechanisms to deal with the causes and symptoms of crises.
But not always.
No. They also noted that some regimes may take whatever unilateral action they felt necessary to survive or maintain control, especially if facing catastrophic change, acting alone if needed.
So a messy mix of cooperation and unilateralism. And what about the global power structure and all this? Who's in charge?
They saw the world transitioning, moving away from a unipolar world dominated by the U.S. after the Cold War, towards a progressively multipolar world, more centers of power. But this transition was expected to be uneven, volatile, with varying degrees of competition and collaboration between powers.
A bumpy ride to multipolarity.
Pretty much. An inherent tension between the desire for collective solutions to global problems and the need for national sovereignty, countries wanting to maintain control.
So, no world government emerging.
The emergence of a new supranational sovereign power was considered unlikely. Instead, you'd get this increasingly complex patchwork of international governance arrangements, but with gaps, strains, open to exploitation and abuse.
Gaps in the system. What were the key drivers shaping this theme of governance and order? What forces were pushing these changes?
The globalized economy itself was a major one. Globalization would remain significant, they thought. Increasing interdependency, yes, but also exposing local markets to external risks, shocks from elsewhere.
Which could lead to pushback.
Yeah, potentially leading to unilateral protectionist actions, or countries making preferential bilateral deals if global systems seemed threatening to their stability. And international organized crime, illicit trade, they were expected to remain major features, exploiting the system.
How big was that illicit trade, did they estimate?
They cited a staggering statistic. The annual global market for illicit drugs alone in 2005 was estimated at $322 billion.
$322 billion.
Yeah. Higher, they noted, than the GDP of 88% of the world's countries at the time. Though they did add that the narcotics trade may decline due to oversupply, legalization, or increasing intolerance. Still a massive factor.
Truly immense.
Yeah.
You mentioned the U.S. transition earlier as well.
Yeah.
How did they see that driving governance and order?
Well, in 2007, the U.S. was clearly the preeminent power, the main guarantor of the international system. So its status, its culture, its intentions, all seen as decisive.
Right.
It would need to adjust to this multipolar transition, the rise of Asia, resource competition, internal pressures too, demographics, debt, social issues. And anti-Americanism, they noted, would likely continue as a vehicle for expressing grievance globally.
And China was obviously a huge factor here, too.
Absolutely huge, seen as one of the most significant global factors, period. Its position as the workshop of the world influencing global demand, labor markets.
Economic clout.
Yeah, and its growing foreign exchange reserves reflecting Western indebtedness. China's political direction was considered crucial globally, but, and this is important, they highlighted the significant internal challenges China faced.
Like what?
Environmental, social, political, financial, demographic challenges. Corruption. Failure to handle these successfully, they warned, may result in economic failure, instability, disorder, unrest, with global repercussions.
But if they succeeded?
Conversely, Chinese success in sustaining rapid growth may result in a challenge to the U.S. status as the global hegemony in the second half of the 21st century.
So China's trajectory seen as potentially reshaping the entire global order, either through internal trouble spilling over or through challenging U.S. dominance.
That was the assessment, a pivotal player.
What other drivers were key to governance and order?
International crime and illicit trade, as we mentioned, expected to grow further, exploiting legitimate structures, new markets, especially in Asia and transnational spaces. Some weak states might even rely on illicit trade for liquidity, posing a major challenge to global governance and finance.
And terrorism. Still a major factor.
Transnational and locally based terrorism, particularly Islamist terrorism, was expected to continue, fueled by political motives, disadvantage, grievance, extending even to marginalized groups and affluent societies.
How did they see its impact?
Casualties seen as relatively low compared to other conflict forms, but the effect magnified by reach, disruption, and what they called the theater of violence, using attacks for psychological impact.
And the CBRN threat.
Yeah.
Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear.
They considered CBRN elements viable and credible possibilities for terrorist attack throughout the period, with a lower possibility of actual nuclear use, but the threat was there.
That's chilling. What about ungoverned spaces, places the state doesn't reach?
Geographical areas not subject to effective governance or rule of law failed states. Certain provinces, cities, population groupings were expected to see increased risks, becoming bases for crime, terrorists, irregular activity, adding complexity to international stability. Gender equality also came up here.
How so?
The growing divide between societies moving towards equality and those not was seen as a defining cultural and social theme, influencing international relationships. Progress would be uneven, shaped by culture, economics.
Technology again? A driver of governance and order too.
Definitely. Innovation coming from more diverse international sources, proliferating widely, making regulation and control harder.
And the risks.
They explicitly warned that exploitation of new technologies could have catastrophic results. Nanotech, biotech, weapons systems, whether unintended like runaway tech or intended like directed energy or EMP weapons.
EMP. Electromagnetic pulse. You mentioned that could fry electronics.
Yes, exactly. Widespread electronic disruption, a potentially paralyzing capability.
Okay, and finally, humanitarian crises as a driver.
Natural and human-caused crises would increasingly affect global media audiences, they thought, leading to growing pressure for intervention, especially when audiences felt connected or threatened. But they also noted that humanitarian fatigue may grow, people becoming overwhelmed or desensitized by the sheer number of crises.
Impassioned fatigue. Right. Okay, that covers governance and order. Let's move to the final key theme, knowledge and innovation. What was the overarching idea here? Technology development.
The core idea was that tech development was expected to be predominantly commercially led.
Commercially led, meaning driven by business.
Largely, yes. The direction and pace dictated mostly by global demand, businesses seeking profitable applications. Sensitive, niche, super high-cost programs would remain military or governmental, sure, but the overall picture was much wider access to technology.
So technology wasn't just for the big state players anymore. It was spreading out.
Correct. Extensive proliferation of access to tech and specialist information to a much wider range of users. Innovation likely to continue at an unprecedented rate coming from multiple sources worldwide.
Making breakthroughs less predictable.
Less predictable and the impacts harder to foresee precisely.
Did they see this eroding the traditional tech dominance of, say, the West?
Yes, they did. The diffusion of innovation, plus labor mobility, skilled people moving around, was expected to erode the technological dominance of leading Western nations, including in defense. Although the sheer scale of U.S. R&D investment would be hard to challenge for a while.
But wider diffusion means more risk.
Increased risk of technology leakage, irresponsible use, illicit use. Definitely.
Would this tech wave lift all boats equally, or widen gaps?
While tech was expected to improve material standards for most, the document was pretty clear. Its application and integration would continue to be unequal.
Reinforcing inequality again.
Yes. Seen as likely to widen the gap between those with the means and access, wealth, education, market reforms, and those without.
What specific tech areas did they pinpoint for rapid advances?
They highlighted ICT, energy tech, biotechnology, cognitive science, sensors and networks, smart materials. Nanotechnology was seen as a crucial enabler across many of these fields.
And the real breakthroughs happen where these fields intersect.
Exactly. Revolutionary outcomes likely where disciplines interacted, like combining cognitive science and ICT, could lead to really advanced decision support tools.
What were the key drivers pushing this unprecedented rate of innovation? Why so fast?
The commercial imperative was primary. Global growth, resource pressures, demographic shifts, all fueling demand and opportunity. Development increasingly directed towards commercial goals. They noted a striking stat. Business enterprises accounted for 68% of OECD R&D spending back in 2003.
Wow, over two-thirds driven by business.
Yeah. That commercial focus drives innovators to find applications quickly. And interdisciplinary R&D, again, likely leading to the most revolutionary, if unpredictable, outcomes.
And innovation wasn't just happening in the usual Western hubs anymore?
No, definitely not. New innovation centers were emerging outside traditional-led regions. Increasing R&D and rising powers was seen as likely leading to a decline and even reversal in Western technological dominance in some areas.
Which countries specifically?
China and India were poised to become technology leaders in specific fields. They noted non-OECD countries increased their global share of R&D from 17% to 20% between 2001 and 2003 alone. China was already the third largest investor globally. Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan, Israel also developing capabilities.
So a much more global, competitive innovation landscape, making intellectual property harder to control.
Absolutely. IP and commercial exclusivity under constant pressure due to this diffusion.
And the people doing the research, the scientists, engineers.
Labor mobility was key. Highly capable, skilled individuals, especially in niche areas, would be increasingly mobile, moving around the global knowledge economy, seeking the best rewards and opportunities.
The brain drain effect.
Initially, yes, often flowing towards OECD countries, but they expected a shift towards brain circulation, a potential reverse flow back to emerging nations as local opportunities improved.
And collaboration across borders was also increasing. Researchers working together internationally.
Significant growth in knowledge sharing, more international R&D collaboration, more non-native research students in top universities. They mentioned the U.S. having about 32% from Asia, more internationally owned patents, knowledge flowing more freely.
What about specific areas driven by global challenges like energy? Was innovation focused there?
Definitely. Demand for new energy sources would stimulate intensive research, driven by both the limits of hydrocarbons and the need to cut carbon emissions.
What kind of alternatives?
Alternatives like biofuels, hydrogen power, potentially nuclear fusion later in the period, expected to see major development. Though they noted, for context, that even with success stories like Brazil's biofuels, biofuels were only expected to make up about 8% of global energy supply by 2020. So a slow transition.
And the search for resources pushing tech into extreme places. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, the exploitation of extreme environments, seen as increasingly urgent, especially for energy. Technology would permit cheaper commercial applications in space, maybe intra-atmospheric environments.
Space exploration, too.
Increase in space exploration, yes. And exploration of other extreme environments, polar regions, the deep ocean, deep underground. This was expected to stimulate extensive tech innovation, much like the NASA program did historically.
Any specific examples?
They specifically mentioned the U.S. Geological Survey estimate that maybe 25% of the remaining global oil and gas reserves are likely in the Arctic. And Arctic warming, expected to be double the global average, would significantly improve the prospects for exploiting those reserves, potentially opening Arctic sea routes, too.
Wow. Climate change enabling resource extraction in the Arctic. Another complex interaction.
Exactly.
Finally, advances in simulation and modeling. Computers getting better at predicting things.
Advances in social science, behavioral science, mathematical modeling, combining with huge increases in processing power. This would permit new levels of pattern recognition, sometimes called combinatorics.
Combinatorics.
Yeah,
Like finding patterns in massive data sets.
essentially, yes. Combining elements to find patterns, decode complex systems, modeling processes, biological, social, political, economic, simulation and representation becoming really powerful tools for policymakers, decision makers.
But with a potential downside.
They noted it could potentially blur the line between illusion and reality, relying too heavily on models, perhaps.
Right. That's a huge amount to take in across those four themes: population, identity, governance, knowledge. A world changing rapidly, full of tension and complex interactions. Now let's turn to the potential downsides more directly. Given all this change, what were the key risks they identified? And how did these translate into specific implications for defense and security, which was, after all, the document's main focus?
Yeah, the document moves right from laying out these trends to looking squarely at the negative potential. They identified significant risks across all the dimensions we've discussed, and then assessed what these meant specifically for military and security planning.
What were some of the most impactful risks they highlighted? What really stood out?
Well, climate change wasn't just seen as a gradual problem. They flagged the risk of more unstable, potentially catastrophic changes happening more rapidly, more widely than expected, severely challenging our collective ability to cope. Energy market instability was another major worry. Overheating markets could lead countries to try and dominate supply. They mentioned China, specifically fueling international tension. Or instability in a supplier region could trigger global price spikes, causing wider political instability, potentially even arresting globalization by hitting the free market hard.
So resource competition could actually undermine the interdependence that globalization created.
Wow.
What about bigger economic risks?
Systemic risks. They considered the risk of a U.S. economic crisis. Back in 2007, the U.S. was the world's most indebted nation, seen as vulnerable to market collapse or crisis, most likely trigger energy market instability again.
And the fallout.
Failure to service its debt could put creditors, suppliers at risk globally, potentially causing a major global economic downturn. This fed into the broader risk of a failure of the global financial system itself, growth vulnerable to shocks, corruption, illicit activity undermining trust, potentially leading states back towards protectionism, regional blocs.
Shifting to social risks, they highlighted something called generation conflict in developed countries.
Yes. The burden of rising costs social care, health, pensions falling on shrinking younger populations in developed countries, coupled with things like unaffordable housing, student debt, compared to the wealth often held by older generations.
Creating resentment between generations.
For potentially leading to widespread protests, instability, social unrest. That was the risk they saw.
And that super diversity you mentioned earlier from immigration, did that also carry risks in their view?
Yes. In countries encouraging immigration to fill labor shortages, the resulting superdiversity, a very high concentration of different ethnicities, languages, origins, may present challenges and threats to social cohesion and economic stability if not managed effectively, potentially imposing significant resource burdens.
What about risks to governance itself? Political risks?
Political extremism was seen as a risk, potentially fueled by a vulnerable middle class reacting badly to economic and social volatility, encouraging a turn towards communitarian solutions or, well, extremist politics, which could then fuel international tension.
And the media landscape.
They worried about declining news quality, the rise of citizen journalists, blogs, online sources, potentially weakening the integrity of mainstream media's editorial function, prioritizing speed, opinion, maybe clicks, over factual reporting.
That sounds familiar. Crime also seemed like a significant risk factor.
Absolutely. They projected growth in crime. Organized criminal groups getting better at exploiting globalization's weaknesses, legitimate business structures, cyberspace, ungoverned spaces,
Working with other destabilizing groups.
collaborating with paramilitary groups, terrorists, corrupt governments, becoming more aggressive, more sophisticated.
Going back to the international order. Risks in new geopolitics.
Yeah.
Major power conflict.
They thought global economic interdependence made major interstate war less likely before 2020. But beyond 2020, increasing pressure on resources, plus the growing assertiveness of emerging powers. This may result in the return of great power rivalries, increasing the risk of conflict between states or blocs.
And nuclear proliferation was obviously a huge risk they flagged.
A very significant one, the spread of nukes beyond the existing powers, especially to weak or unstable states, seen as likely to increase the risks of more uninhibited, assertive, and intemperate behavior by those states, makes them harder to deter with conventional military power.
And the risk of non-state actors getting hold of them.
The risk of technologies or materials being acquired by third parties, non-state actors like criminals or terrorists, considered a distinct possibility, creating huge new security challenges.
They even considered risks to existing alliances, like the U.S. potentially pulling back from Europe.
They suggested a shift in U.S. strategic focus, maybe towards Asia, plus a changing power balance in the Americas. This may result in a significant reduction in its engagement with Europe, challenging NATO's viability. Cooperation would likely continue, but maybe at lower levels, with the U.S. focusing more on its own capabilities. Related to that was the risk of European stagnation. If EU integration slowed, economic or political differences widened. European states could become more vulnerable to global challenges: competition, migration, terrorism, crime, climate change.
Could that spur more cooperation?
It might, based on self-interest, but the potential for populism, nationalism, protectionism was seen as remaining high. Further significant political integration in Europe was deemed unlikely without a major, tangible, immediate threat emerging.
And the UN's role, was that seen as at risk?
They worried about UN decline if it failed to reform effectively, eroding its credibility, its authority to resolve conflict, leading to individual powers or new groupings filling the vacuum, pursuing self-interest, thereby expanding the risks of wider confrontation and conflict.
Arms rivalry seems like a natural consequence of these geopolitical shifts, doesn't it?
It does. Increasing strategic competition likely to stimulate intensive arms races. They mentioned China-US, India-Pakistan as examples, diverting resources from development, intensifying regional tensions, increasing the chances of conflict.
What about risks stemming directly from technology itself, beyond just its use?
Well, besides the catastrophic exploitation we discussed, they mentioned the risk of the perverse application of technology. Benign tech being intentionally subverted for hostile use.
Like what?
Like combining biotechnology and genetic engineering to create designer bioweapons, maybe targeting specific ethnic groups.
That's a deeply disturbing thought. Horrifying.
It is. They also saw risk in the role of artificial intelligence, over-reliance on AI for knowledge management, decision support, creating new vulnerabilities opponents could exploit.
And just trusting the information environment.
The authenticity of information seen as a growing challenge. The info environment getting more crowded, sources more variable, harder to source, validate, and ethical challenges would increase as innovation outpaced ethical norms, making it easier for bad actors to evade controls.
And finally, technology reinforcing inequality.
Inequality linked to tech access, market pricing, or regulation potentially blocking access to beneficial breakthroughs, new medicines, clean energy for those who need them most. Reinforcing inequality, grievance.
What's fascinating here, listening to this list of risks from 2007 looking out to 2036, so many of them feel incredibly relevant, almost uncannily so, to the world we're navigating right now.
It is quite striking, isn't it, the persistence of these themes?
So how did these risks and the overall trends translate into specific implications for defense and security planning? That was the document's core purpose, after all.
Right. They directly connected these global shifts to their impact on military and security matters. For instance, spending priorities. Increased mobility of capital globally might reduce states' ability to tax effectively, forcing difficult spending choices, including how much priority to give defense versus other needs. And given the U.S. role back then, U.S. economic vulnerability was a big one. A significant downturn reducing its international posture. This may lead to increased global tension, interstate rivalry, and a greater military provision and possibly intervention by other nations stepping into the vacuum.
They even thought about how militaries might actually have to operate differently in the future, like dealing with megacity failure.
Yes. They projected that a large city or multiple cities, especially in a developing region, may fail before 2035. State functions collapse within the city.
And the consequences.
The effects would be equivalent to state failure, which city failure may, in turn, precipitate. Stabilizing such a city militarily would demand a huge, comprehensive interagency approach, specialist skills, and enduring commitment. A massive, complex undertaking.
That ties right into another implication they mentioned. Endemic, urban-based, irregular conflict.
Exactly. They saw unregulated urbanization creating future adversaries with highly developed urban survival and combat skills. People who grew up navigating complex, often dangerous cityscapes. And they'd choose to operate in sprawling cities already experiencing endemic lawlessness and violence, fighting increasingly happening in dense urban environments, not open fields.
And finding soldiers would get harder in some places. Recruitment.
Correct. Armed forces in societies with aging or declining young populations, mostly the developed world, may find it progressively difficult to attract recruits, made worse by longer education, competitive job markets.
So what's the solution? Robots?
Well, may lead to an expansion of technical applications, yes, more automation, possibly coupled with increasing recourse to the use of foreign or commercial manpower, mercenaries, basically.
And in countries with lots of young people.
Conversely, societies with large youth populations, often in less prosperous countries, are likely to experience difficulties meeting their aspirations, which could fuel endemic violence, external aggression, migration if opportunities aren't there. They also noted how the use of the media would impact every aspect of conflict, not just traditional media, but internet, citizen journalists, states, non-state actors. Everyone will seek to dominate the agenda, influence perceptions, especially in crises. Unfiltered news may play an increasingly influential role, and regimes might try to control coverage technologically or coercively.
Irregular activity seemed like it would become the dominant form of conflict, rather than state-on-state wars.
Very much so. In the expected absence of widespread direct state-on-state conflict, they foresaw a marked increase in the prevalence of irregular activity.
Meaning?
Criminality, terrorism, disorder, insurgency, fueled by a mix of things. Grievance, deprivation, resentment, or just market forces, boredom even. State sponsorship of proxies was also expected. Armed criminal, terrorist, or insurgent groups seen as a permanent feature of the strategic landscape.
And Islamist terrorism specifically.
Expected to persist. With unassimilated diaspora communities in places like Europe potentially harboring elements aiming to disrupt host societies.
What other military implications stood out?
Continued importance of maritime security. Most world trade, energy, travels by sea, often through unstable choke points, requiring high levels of international cooperation, dependence on maritime power. Forced projection might become trickier. Developed states might be reluctant to intervene in failed states or ungoverned spaces without clear mandates or credible national benefit. More emphasis perhaps on containment or deterring threats to partners. Securing access would be vital.
What about the weapons themselves? Defense production.
Becoming increasingly internationalized. Most states lacking capacity for rapid surge production in a crisis, concentrating the economic burden on fewer states, leading to needs for niche capabilities, cooperative solutions, and secure access to resupply chains for consumables, ammo, fuel becomes critical.
And how adversaries might adapt their tactics to counter sophisticated forces.
They expected opponents to recognize the advantages of going underground, literally. Using subterranean networks, tunnels, bunkers, complex basements to avoid sophisticated surveillance and targeting, especially in those complex urban spaces. They also discussed the impact of AI. Not sentient AI, but soft AI, advanced software for knowledge management, decision support. Seen as likely to change the emphasis in military training from technical skills to the application of judgment, affecting manpower, command structures.
What about the impact of technology on actual fighting power? Does better tech always win?
Not necessarily. They noted successful exploitation will depend on the user's understanding of both the advantages and the limitations. You could be defeated by an opponent using a better mix of old and new capabilities, or targeting areas where your tech doesn't apply. Small tech changes were seen as likely to lead to disproportionately large increases in capability sometimes, speeding up the concept to capability timeline, but also increasing tech leakage, use of off-the-shelf components. A related implication was the development of cheaper, more lethal weapons. Future tech and competitive markets likely to result in weapons that are cheaper, more portable, more destructive, widely available, easier to use.
Lowering the bar for entry into lethal conflict.
Potentially unsettling, especially in poor, unstable regions. Allowing less developed states, non-state actors to potentially close the tech gap with traditional military powers.
They even considered the risk of deliberate targeting of civilians through infrastructure, not just accidental collateral damage.
Yes. Deliberate collateral casualties. State or non-state actors may target commercial and industrial installations to inflict mass casualties in breach of international law. Risk increased by industrialization, nuclear power plants, dense urban populations in vulnerable areas, and finally, nuclear proliferation affecting intervention options, making operations against autocratic leaders in nuclear-armed states particularly risky. Plus, the need to be prepared for the failure of CBRN-armed states dealing with unsecured materials and expertise in failing states or cities.
That is a sobering, dense, but incredibly detailed look at the potential challenges and their military consequences as seen from 2007.
But beyond these trends and risks, they also consider those major discontinuities, the strategic shocks, the totally unexpected events.
Yes, they made it really clear shocks will happen. This wasn't about forecasting trends anymore. It was about exploring radical departures that could completely change global outcomes.
Based on what? Plausible triggers? Wild speculation. A mix. Some based on plausible triggers, others more conjectural. They explicitly used historical examples, Minoan civilization, Black Death, to underscore the point that massive, unexpected, transformative events do occur, even if rarely.
What were some of the most intriguing, maybe unsettling examples of strategic shocks they envisioned? What kind of wildcards were they thinking about?
A megavolcanic or seismic event was one. They reference Krakatoa, or an Indonesian eruption around 535 AD, talking about dramatic regional and global effects, ash blocking sunlight, impacting climate, agriculture worldwide for years, and the impact amplified by today's population density and global interdependency. Another really dramatic one was a methane catastrophe. We touched on methane earlier.
From the Arctic and oceans, right?
Yeah, vast amounts stored there. While a massive release was considered unlikely, they noted extreme conditions, warming, seismic activity, maybe even mining could trigger a massive abrupt release, leading to a runaway warming feedback cycle, potentially catastrophic implications for all life on Earth.
A runaway feedback cycle. That sounds absolutely terrifying. Like something out of science fiction.
It does, but it was a plausible, if low probability, catastrophic risk they felt needed consideration. On a potentially more positive, though still hugely disruptive note, they considered a revolution in the supply of energy.
A sudden breakthrough.
Yeah, a sudden early breakthrough in areas like hydrogen power, fuel cells, maybe even nuclear fusion, advanced biofuels, something that dramatically reduces dependence on fossil fuels in unstable regions, fundamentally altering geopolitics.
What about shocks related to human biology or technology applied directly to humans?
They posited something called new humans.
New humans.
This was the ethically charged idea of applying advanced genetics beyond medical uses for significant super enhancement of human attributes, physical strength, senses, maybe intelligence.
Creating super soldiers or something.
It's just creating extreme biological variation between individuals or societies, potentially creating additional reasons for conflict. A really controversial idea.
And one of the most startlingly science fiction-like shocks they mentioned, the one that really jumps out.
That would probably be broadcast to the brain.
Broadcast to the brain.
Yeah. They suggested that by 2035, an implantable information chip could be developed and wired directly to the user's brain.
Seriously.
That was the speculation. Information, entertainment accessed instantly via cognition. Synthetic sensory perception beamed direct to the user's senses. They even mentioned the possibility of synthetic telepathy, mind-to-mind dialogue enabled by tech.
Wow.
They were clear about the obvious: military, security, control, legal, ethical implications of something like that.
An implantable brain chip for synthetic telepathy potentially by 2035. That shows just how far out they were willing to let their analysis go when considering shocks. Thinking the unthinkable.
They really pushed the boundaries in that section.
What about disruptive weapons technology as a shock?
Electromagnetic pulse use was one. EMP. They suggested EMP capabilities will probably become operational during the period out to 2035, able to destroy ICT devices over selected areas, limiting physical damage.
But crippling electronically.
Exactly. High-value military or government networks might be hardened, but most of society's networks wouldn't be. They explicitly stated that using an EMP weapon against a major world city would have significant impact far beyond the target country.
How significant?
It might even reduce political and business confidence in globalized economic processes to the point that it reverses internationally integrative trends, leading to a world increasingly characterized by protection, control, and isolationism.
So a single EMP attack on a major city could potentially stop globalization in its tracks.
Yeah.
Reverse decades of integration.
That was the scale of potential disruption they considered plausible as a shock. Another weapon shock was the magic bullet.
The magic bullet.
The idea that accelerating military tech could lead to the invention of a cheap, simple, easy-to-use weapon, effective against a wide range of targets with no established countermeasures, maybe based on civilian tech, flooding global arms markets, drastically altering perceptions of force, power balances.
Those examples really highlight the sheer range of possibilities they considered. from geology to genetics to brain implants to game-changing weapons. It wasn't just about predicting trends, was it? It was about being mentally prepared for radical, system-altering surprises.
They were rigorous in considering not just the likely, but the plausible, and even the highly conjectural, emphasizing that understanding potential discontinuities, however remote they seem, is key to preparedness and resilience. You can't predict them, but you can think about how you might react.
Okay, looking back at this document from 2007, remembering it was looking out all the way to 2036. We're actually getting pretty close to the halfway point of the period they covered now, aren't we?
We are indeed, around 17, 18 years in.
You mentioned earlier they deliberately included non-Western perspectives through that lead international survey. What did that survey actually reveal? How did those views compare to the DCDC's own outlook?
While they found general agreement with DCDC's key themes among those predominantly non-Western respondents. So the broad trends resonated globally, but the survey did highlight a few areas for perhaps greater emphasis or different nuance.
Like what? What did the non-Western respondents particularly emphasize?
The growing disparity between haves and have-nots, that global inequality theme, was raised across different parts of the survey by a large number of respondents. The strength of that opinion really reinforced DCDC's decision to make it a core ring road issue. It wasn't just a Western perception.
Okay, inequality was universally seen as critical. What else?
Non-Western respondents also noted the need for maybe more emphasis on adapting to climate change, not just mitigating it, and the continuing significance of religion, perhaps in contrast to the wider trend towards secularization the main document also noted, religion remaining a powerful force.
And what was their overall outlook for the world by 2036 based on these trends? Were they generally optimistic or pessimistic?
It was mixed, actually. Overall, most non-Western respondents judged that the world would be better or at least no worse in the future than it was in 2007.
Better or no worse?
Okay.
In what ways better?
They saw the greatest prospects for improvement in access to information, health, and education. Technology helping there, perhaps.
But ambivalent about other areas.
More ambivalent about improvements in governance and wealth distribution. And crucially, most believed that crime and conflict would be worse.
Worse crime and conflict, despite improvements elsewhere.
Yeah. The document noted this balance of responses, optimism on some fronts, pessimism on security, accorded closely with DCDC's own overall outlook.
It's fascinating to see that alignment, isn't it? Especially on the negative outlook for crime and conflict, even amid expected material improvements. It reinforces that core tension they identified right at the start, interdependence and competition, creating both opportunities and dangers.
What's fascinating here is how that act of seeking diverse perspectives actually validated some of the core tensions DCDC identified internally, like the overwhelming significance of global inequality that wasn't just a Western think tank concern. It came back strongly from the global survey.
This whole deep dive into a 2007 document, it offers such a detailed, almost forensic snapshot of how the future was being analyzed from that specific point in time. It shows us a world they saw emerging by 2036, characterized, as you said, by that intense tension between interconnectedness and competition, driven by profound changes across society, tech, politics, economics, the environment.
And anticipating significant risks, surprising potential shocks that could just radically alter the whole landscape.
Exactly. And even if not every single prediction turned out perfectly accurate and they were clear the future is unpredictable, subject to chance, human choices.
Value isn't really in judging their accuracy score.
No. The value is absolutely in the analysis itself, isn't it? Understanding the forces they saw at play, rehearsing those possibilities like they said, and maybe being better prepared, more thoughtful in how we respond to whatever the future actually brings you, the listener.
It's about the thinking process, the frameworks they used.
So what does this all mean?
Well, this raises an important question, I think. In a world that seems increasingly shaped by both the predictable, slow burn trends they identified and the potential for radical, unpredictable surprises or shocks they anticipated, how do we as individuals, as societies, balance the need to plan based on probabilities, the likely stuff, with the necessity of being resilient, adaptable, ready for events that completely defy prediction?